Today, our sermon is going to be a little different in the sense that we are going to have a little history lesson. This sermon really came to me about a month ago when I was with our 7th and 8th graders down in Yellowstone Park. Mrs. Wachter, our head teacher, is here and was there as well. And the ranger that was with us that day told a story about a gentleman who was in Yellowstone Park before Yellowstone Park was even a park. And part of that story reminded me as I was sitting there on that hillside about a story from the Bible that has a whole lot to do with what we're talking about today. And so today we are going to look at the glory to God from our heart. We begin today way back in 1870, the middle part of August 17th, in Helena, Montana, where there were 13 men who we would call civilians in our story because of what will happen shortly, that were going to be part of the Washburn, Langford, and Doane expedition into what now we know as Yellowstone Park. They were going to kind of map out that area. There was things that is a developing country. We were interested in that part of the world. But that part of the world was pretty scary, as you might well imagine if you went there to see it for the first time. Almost prehistoric, with steam rising out of the ground, geysers going off, all kinds of things that are there. And so this expedition was given the task of going into the park and kind of mapping things out. They would begin in Helena on that August 17th day, and they would actually travel first right here to Bozeman, Montana. For those who are students out at our academy, they would travel right to where the area your academy is, to Fort Ellis, where they would be picking up 6 additional people for the expedition, these being military men to go and escort the civilians on their journey into what is now Yellowstone Park. They would leave with 40 horses, some pack mules, and a dog, and with them the main character in our story, one of the 9 civilians, a man by the name of Truman Everts. Truman Everts is an interesting person. He was the oldest member of the expedition at 54 years old and was also very, very nearsighted, needed his glasses desperately to see. Opinionated would be a nice way of describing him. And so as this expedition headed out, they reached the park on August 21st, or what we know now as the park, in the Mammoth area, and began to work their way down towards Yellowstone Lake. It was on September 7th that 2 of the men from the party got lost during the day as they were trying to look for an easier way to get around. Now, one of the problems that they had back then is something we notice as we drive through the park today. They have a lot of lodgepole pine in Yellowstone Park, a very small diameter tree sometimes that grows very close together with its neighbors, and it becomes a very deep, dark forest in places that is hard to get through. So when you have 40 horses and some pack mules, they spent a lot of time in those early parts of the expedition reloading the mules because they would lose their loads trying to go between these lodgepole pine. And so these men were out looking and had gotten lost and didn't get back till late at night. And the next night around the campfire there, Everts was giving them a very hard time for getting lost. And even a harder time for how they found their way back and why it took so long. And he was chiding them that if it would have been him who had been lost, instead of trying to zigzag back and forth and find camp, he'd have simply went to Yellowstone Lake and followed the shoreline up because they were mapping out Yellowstone Lake and would have been somewhere close to the shore. Ironically, it was only 2 days later, on September 9th, when Everts himself was out looking for an easier way that he got turned around. Now, he wouldn't say that he was lost on day 1. he would just say that he wasn't able to get back to camp before nightfall, and so he spent the night out in the deep, dark forest, fully planning on the next day, using his plan of heading towards the lake and finding the shoreline and going back and finding the rest of the party. Next morning he headed out, and in those thick, dark lodgepole never found the lake. A matter of fact, he was simply going this way and that way and really going nowhere at all. And so late that afternoon, he decided that he needed to climb up on the highest point he could find and try to get some bearings, because he was now beginning to think he might actually be close to being lost. Some of us men that have been out in the woods have been close to being lost. Turned around, yes, but never lost, right? Everett's had a bad habit, though. Whenever he would get off of his horse, he would tend not to tie it up. And so on this occasion, what he practiced, he did. And he walked to the top of the ridge, began trying to see and get his bearings when he heard a commotion behind him. He turned around just in time to see his horse disappearing into the thick lodgepole. On his horse was everything he owned. He had 2 knives in his pocket, his eyeglasses that he was wearing, and a small powder pan in his pocket. That was it. His food, his extra clothes, anything else that he might have had was long gone with his horse, and he would never see them again. It was at this point that Everett came to the conclusion that without a horse and without seeing anything from a higher elevation that resembled anything that he had seen before, that he was indeed lost. You ever had a bad day before? That was kind of a bad day. But for Truman Everett, he was to have 37 long and bad days. For 37 days, he would be lost in what we now know as Yellowstone Park. And his experience for those 37 days is rather amusing when you read it, knowing that you don't have to go through it. But when you really think about it, it's pretty amazing that after the 37 days, he is still alive. His main fear, once he recognized and acknowledged that he was lost, were some of the wild animals that they had seen. There were things like big mountain lions and grizzly bears that they had seen, and he really wasn't overly excited about those things. But more than the animals, he was afraid of the 2 Indian tribes that were there, the Crows and the Bannocks that were in that area. And so he didn't sleep really good the first couple of nights. But you can imagine this as well, with no, at that time at least in his mind, way of building a fire. September in Yellowstone at night can tend to be a little bit on the what? Cold side. And so Everett's was very cold. He was afraid, and then things started to compile. He woke up one morning with severe frostbite on his feet. Again, heading to look towards the lake in an effort to find his party, the very nearsighted Everett's, even though he was afraid of the 2 Indian tribes, was very much excited to see what appeared to him at least to be a canoe with a single oarsman heading right towards the shoreline. He ran down off of the hill, surmising in his mind that though it would be an Indian likely in that canoe, that it wouldn't be a problem for him because he had no gun, he had no anything, and so they would certainly take pity on him. When he reached the shoreline, in his words, as you read the book about him, he believes really that the canoe and its oarsman turned into some kind of bird spirit that flew away, because it was nothing more than a pelican that was swimming in the lake towards the shore. Nearsighted doesn't really describe his seeing problem. And it's probably no wonder that when he went up on top of the hill to get his bearings, it really wasn't doing him a whole lot of good, considering he couldn't tell the difference between a person in a canoe and a pelican. But it was a short time later that he found something that was good for those cold nights with literally nothing. He would cover himself with pine boughs and so forth, but obviously he wasn't doing much good for his feet. Now, as you go to Yellowstone Park today, you can visit the thermal areas where there's steam coming out of the ground, geysers and so forth, but you have to stay on what as you go observe them? The boardwalks. Are there any signs that remind you of that? Yeah, we're in good shape that way. You have to be disobedient and really not too wise to disregard the sign and walk in places where you're not supposed to be. Everett's didn't have boardwalks or signs. He found that sleeping at night was a whole lot warmer if he would go and lay close to one of these thermal vents. The ground was nice and toasty warm underneath of him, and the pine boughs that he would lay on. One night, however, the ground began to tremor a little bit, and as Everett's woke up, the crust over that thermal area gave way. And he went down into some very, very hot water and severely burned his left hip. This laid him up for quite some time and would ail him, obviously, for a lot longer than the 37 days that he was lost. But it was after this time, when he was trying to figure out how he could stay warm, looking out on the lake where he saw the sun reflecting off the lake, that he had an idea. These glasses that I'm wearing, maybe I could reflect the sun through them as you could a magnifying glass and start a fire that way. As one who has actually done that to a few anthills in my day when I was younger, with the aid of some accelerants perhaps, you can start fires with glass and sunshine. An interesting thing. And so he learned how to build a fire. Now, because of his hip, he couldn't lay down and sleep at night, and shortly after he had figured out how to build fires, he would sleep with his back up against a tree sitting down and have the fire in front of him. He woke up with a start one night and, trying to get up because of the commotion, stumbled and put his left hand right down into his fire. So now he has a severely burned left hand and hip. But he wasn't done with the fire. On another occasion, he was debating during the day whether he should build a fire because the wind was blowing very, very hard. The coldness of the day convinced him that a fire would be a good idea, even though in his mind the wind might be an issue. He went to sleep that night with a campfire in front of him, woke up later that night in the middle of a forest fire, severely burning his other arm. So now we have a burned hip, burned hand, burned arm, not having an overly good trip. Oh, and we forgot real cold feet, right? Frostbite. And, well, we won't talk about those things. He had some other issues. That probably had to do with the fact that he didn't eat real well while he was in the park. Remember, he has no food. Now, one would think, well, he had knives. He could be, the Davy Crockett guy or Daniel Boone guy and use those knives. But the problem is when he had burned his hip in that vented area, he lost both of his knives down into that thermal area. So no knives. He tried to be a fisherman. Very ingeniously, he took the wire rims around the edges of his glasses, fashioned it into a fish hook. It wasn't hard to find fishing line because by this time his clothes were falling apart, and it was easy to unravel some thread or whatever his clothes were made out of, attach it to his fishing hook, and he would find little grub stuff and put it on there and try to fish. Now, he wasn't a very good fisherman because for those 37 days, he never ever caught a fish. Kind of reminds me of fishing with Joel. I never catch anything, he catches them all, is what I meant. You guys were thinking I was... Joel catches fish every time he goes. So no fish, but it wasn't that he didn't have opportunity to eat fish, because in a small backwater one day, he did find a bunch of little tiny minnows that he was able to catch, and he ate those minnows raw, as well as a songbird that he caught. But his main diet was what we call elk thistle today. He would eat the root of that. And that is basically what sustained him. Not overly good tasting, but it filled him up, and that's what he ate. Now there was one other thing he ate, and this just a short time before his rescue, that he said was the best thing that he ate the entire 37 days. As he was going across a field, he found the wing of a dead seagull. Where the rest of the seagull was, I have no idea, but there was this fresh wing that was off of a seagull. He took the feathers off, and then he took a rock and whatever meat is on a seagull wing, which would be very little, he crushed it, bones and all, into a fine powder, and took out his little powder pan that held less than a half pint of water, and he poured the ground up seagull wing into the water, boiled it, and ate it, and he said it's the best broth that he had ever tasted. Now, if you haven't eaten for a long time, it probably influences the taste just a little bit. So if you have struggles eating some of the soup you have at home, just don't eat for a lot of days and it will taste better. And you could go on and on about his experiences. Never really was close to being found or finding the rest of the expedition party. The closest they got, they figured, was about a mile at one time near the end of Yellowstone Lake, but neither one of them knew the other was there. The expedition had went on this trip with 40 days of provisions. Since they had started in August and he was lost for 37 days, the math tells us that they headed back to Helena before he was ever found, assuming that he was lost and dead or had found another way out. He had a judge friend in Helena that when he found out that Everts hadn't returned, wanted him found. And so he said, here is $600 for whoever finds him, dead or alive. There was a man by the name of Jack Baronet and his friend George Pritchett that decided $600 sounded pretty good, and so they headed off from Helena down into what we know as Yellowstone Park, looking for Truman Everts. And after a couple of days of searching, a miraculous thing happened. They stumbled across him in a snowy field. He was on his hands and knees, crawling like a baby, unable to even walk at this point. He weighed 55 pounds. Stop and think about that. 55 pounds, crawling on his hands and knees through the snow when they found him. Pritchett went back and found some other help. Now that they had found him, they got him to a cabin that was somewhere halfway between Helena and where they were in the park there, and nursed him back to enough health to get him to Helena. And this is where the story is fascinating and as interesting as it is, really struck me as the ranger was sharing it that day, because there's some unfinished business, right? Baronet and Pritchett have a reward coming, some $600. They're anxious to get back to Helena with their find, Mr. Everts. And when they get there, the judge tells them, no, I'm not obligated to pay you the $600 because You found him alive, and therefore he has to pay you for being found. So things just keep going good for Mr. Everett, right? So if you're Baronet and Pritchett, are you just going to say, okay, we didn't want the $600 anyway, or are you going to go see Truman Everett's and try to get your money? They went, explained the story, and these were Everett's words, and this is what stuck in my mind more than anything else in the story. Absolutely no gratitude or thankfulness towards the men who had found him. He said, I will not pay you because I didn't need you. I would have made it out myself. Stop and think about that. I would have made it myself. In the condition that he was. Pretty impossible, huh? But as I was sitting on the hillside, it reminded me of a story in Scripture, and we're going to turn there today. Luke chapter 17, and we want to begin here in verse 11, and we will read down through verse 19. Luke chapter 17, verses 11 through 19, in your Pew Bible, if you're using that, page 1036. Luke chapter 17 rather, verse 11, and going down through verse 19. It says there, now on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, Jesus, Master, have pity on us. When he saw them, he said, go, show yourself to the priests. And as they went, they were what? They were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner? Then he said to him, rise and go, your faith has made you well. 10 men who had leprosy. Leprosy was a disease that in Jesus' day was a death nail. There was no cure, and because you had that disease, you could be around no one else. You had to be outside of the towns or the villages. You could be within only a certain distance of civilization. Your only means of surviving would be what someone might give you when they had pity for you and the condition you were in. Ultimately, if you had leprosy, you would literally watch your extremities disappear and die. That was your outcome. No one cared. A matter of fact, no one wanted to care, because when you had leprosy, it was a sign that you were a very, very bad sinner. Leprosy actually represented to them back then sin, because it was very ugly. Very much like sin is in our world today, right? But Jesus comes along. There's an interesting thing about this story, because as we read it here, it tells us that they were along the border between Samaria and Galilee, and Jesus was headed towards where? Jerusalem. Jesus was headed toward the city of who? Of God. Those men were outside of the city with no way of getting in, with a death decree on their lives because of their leprosy. And in their place and in their condition, God sent who? Jesus. Perhaps you're seeing a parallel. And Jesus comes, and he hears their cry. And he says, go and show yourselves to the priests. and as they went, they were healed. We like to talk about the one who came back and said, "Thank you." Today, for just a moment, I want us to contemplate the 9 who never came back. 9 men who were healed, just like the 10th, but didn't come back to thank Jesus. Jesus himself asked, weren't there 10? Where are the other 9? Have you ever wondered why they may not have come back? Would there be a good excuse or reason for them not to come back? Well, perhaps it was something like, well, now that we're healed, we have family to see, places to go, things to do. We're too busy to give thanks to God. Does that seem, even in this day and age, like a reasonable reason that we might not give thanks to God? We're too busy? Perhaps since they were sent to the priest at the temple, perhaps going to the temple, perhaps just going to church is good enough for what Jesus has done. Just showing up where you're supposed to go is good enough. There really is no reason to go back to Jesus to say thanks. Do you suppose that may have been a reason? Or do you suppose maybe that because Jesus had told them to do something and they were obedient, a matter of fact, they followed his instructions perfectly, that they really felt they were the reason that they had been healed because they had done what they were supposed to do. Their good works, their obedience had somehow brought their healing, and so there's no reason to go back and give thanks to Jesus because they were really the ones who were responsible. Much like Mr. Everett's, they didn't need anybody really because they could make it on their own. Could that be a reason why somebody today might not give thanks to Jesus? We could probably think of a lot of different things, but I don't want to dwell on the 9, but I do want to remind us of something today. We are no different than the 10 lepers. If we have any kind of a heart for Jesus, one day we want to be in the holy city of God. Is that your desire today? But we aren't in the holy city of God right now. We're somewhere out there headed in that direction. But you know what? There's a problem in each of our hearts today. Like the disease of leprosy, we all have the disease of sin. And without healing, without a cure, there will never be any way that we can enter into the city of God. But like those 10 lepers, God looks down on us and he has compassion. And so he sent someone our way. Someone to walk past us in our difficult place. And that someone was Jesus. And that Jesus hears our cry. And that Jesus has done everything that needs to be done to heal us of our disease. And the question becomes today, are we like the 9, or are we like the 1? Let's stop and look at the 1 again so we can determine if we fit into that category. We've looked at the 9, but let's look at the 1 because it tells us there that in verse 15, one of them, when he saw he was healed, came back and he was praising God with what? What does it tell us? It says he was praising God with a loud voice. Why do you think the Bible tells us that it was with a loud voice? Couldn't it have just said he came back praising God? But it goes out of the way to say he came back praising God with a loud voice. When you use a loud voice, does anyone else hear you praising God? This man came back to Jesus, proclaiming to his world where he lived what Jesus Christ had done for him. Did you know that that is the responsibility and the calling that God has given you today? The last ray of merciful light to reach this world before Jesus comes will be his people proclaiming to the world around them what Jesus Christ has done in their lives. What has Jesus done for you? Is it worthy of your praise and thanksgiving? Is it worthy of a loud voice proclaiming what Jesus has done? I hear in this day and age a lot of proclaiming about the bad that's going to happen in the world, about the things we should do or shouldn't do, or about this or that, but I hear very, very few loud voices proclaiming, this is what Jesus Christ has done for me. He's healed me, and He saved me. But you know what? There's something else we learn from this man. Because sometimes words are not enough. Sometimes words are not enough. Because you see, in this world, we have become pretty good at speaking words that sound good. But they don't really reflect all the time what is here. The Bible tells us that this one man did more than just speak words. It says he came back praising God with a loud voice, and he threw himself at Jesus' feet. Now my Bible says, and gave thanks. If you have the King James Bible, I think it says it in a lot better way. It says he fell at Jesus' feet giving thanks. In other words, the very act of falling humbly, going before Jesus and worshiping Him was his thanks and his praise. You see, sometimes words are not enough. Sometimes we need to show it from our hearts. And there's one other thing I think we need to understand about this man's thanksgiving and his praise. Is one time enough? Last verse we're going to look at is Hebrews chapter 13. End of our Bibles here, Hebrews chapter 13. And we're going to look at verse 15. Page 1194 in your Pew Bible, Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 15. And notice what it says here. I think this was the heart of this one out of the 10 who came back. It says, through Jesus, therefore let us do what? My Bible says continually offer to God a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that confess His name. I think that was the heart of the one who came back. He recognized Jesus as more than just a one-time thing that brought healing. He recognized Jesus as something bigger, and Jesus tells us that he recognized that in this man as well, because at the end of the story, he says, you came back, your faith has done what? Made you whole. The actual word there is saved. Your faith has what? Saved you. This wasn't just a one-time experience. For this man, it was eternity. And on his heart, on his lips, the continual sacrifice of praise. Are you the one today or the nine? You know, as I read this story, I think often that it's very easy to fall into the category of the nine. Whatever our reason might be, whether we're too busy or whatever, we tend to forget what God has done. Ralph Emerson Waldo, the poet from years gone by, once posed this question: if the stars were to come out only one night a year, what would you do on that night? What do you think? If 364 days of the year there were no stars in the heavens, but on one day there were stars, what would you do that one day? Wake up. His reply to his own question was, everyone would be out all night looking at the stars. But, he goes on to say, because they are there every night, we never notice them or take time to look. Continually offering thanksgiving and praise. That is our calling today. We can't make it on our own. But in Jesus, we've already made it. Sola, Gloria. To God and God alone be the glory.